Guys, AMD is now down over 60% year to date. And so from a price to intrinsic value of the chip makers, of the strong ones at least, I believe AMD is the cheapest opportunity in the investment world today. And that's what I'm going to cover in this video. But first, guys, let me run that intro. What's up, guys, and let's dive right into this one. And as I do it, guys, please hit that like button to satisfy the YouTube gods. Now let's go into this. So you can see that AMD is now down over 60% year to date. And of course, the reason why the share price is down so much is because we have pricing issues. So these chips are more expensive and we have a supply glut as a result of the economic slowdown. And so there are near-term headwinds facing companies like AMD. And also, the other thing that AMD is facing, which NVIDIA is not necessarily facing, is that the consumer has really stopped purchasing computers or PCs in this environment right now, which is a big segment for AMD because they have that core personal computing market that they compete with Intel, and of course NVIDIA is not in that market. So that of course explains why AMD is down more than NVIDIA in this market. However, let's dive into their segments to give you an example of why you shouldn't necessarily be worried about that. Notice that they compete in the data center market, so that's your cloud computing space. Of course, they have that client market, which is where they compete with Intel. Now, note, Intel owns this market. They have approximately 60% market share. AMD has approximately 40% market share. But note, guys, that Intel used to have 80% market share, and they've lost market share to AMD. And I do believe, and I will explain to you why, AMD will continue to take market share from Intel in this client space. In the gaming space, their RDNA chips are now getting so strong that I would say that they're likely on par to compete with the NVIDIA GPUs. And of course, they continue to be a leader in the embedded space. I need to learn more about the embedded space before I can opine on it intelligently. And of course, when it comes to the leadership of the chip space, like I've said to you before, I do believe that NVIDIA is number one for me in this space, but AMD is a close second. And the reason why is because I believe that both AMD and NVIDIA sit in the sweet spot in the chip space as they focus on high margin design and utilize the new production technologies that are rolled out at Taiwan Semiconductor. I believe that this is a recipe for sustained growth in this oligopoly industry, and I will explain why AMD is going to eat Intel's lunch. And so notice that this is what's causing revenue to increase year over year. Now, of course, there has been a slowdown, and despite what I wrote in the top left there, we really know that the slowdown is because of the inventory glut, higher prices, and a consumer general slowdown. And of course, guys, don't be fooled with the GAAP results when it comes to AMD's results. Profitability is actually continuing to increase and gross profit margins are now above 50%. The GAAP results actually reflect a non-cash amortization charge from the intangibles acquired in a recent transaction. So just take that into account, and I actually adjusted for that in my valuation. And when you adjust for those non-cash charges, you can see that they actually did it here. Their EPS is still up 67% year over year. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that EPS will continue to increase year over year because we do have that general market slowdown. But what I am saying is that results have still been strong for AMD. And now, guys, notice that they do provide new segmentation. So if you're looking at sort of prior year's financial statements, just note that the new segmentation will help us better forecast out revenues. And so I do believe that their Q4 release in this year will give 4 or 5 years of historical data based on segmentation, or at least I hope they do. And so what are the segments? So they got the data center, the client, the gaming, and the embedded segments. I've already talked about these already earlier in this video. And so that just gives us a better idea as to the direction that this is going. I don't like to see their client segment being so large. I do believe that the data center and the gaming segments will overtake the client segment, and that's good. I don't want to see their leading segment in the client segment. Now, the other thing is I do believe that they're going to continue to dominate in the client segment as well. So it's not the worst thing in the world that their largest segment is client, but I would love to see their largest segment being that data center. And so you might be wondering what exactly is in there. So the data center, they got those CPUs for the growth of the cloud computing business. So for those servers in the client segment, that's your desktop and notebook PC business and processors. And so that's what I mean where they're competing against Intel. You probably have seen like the Intel core processors. And then, of course, in laptops and notebooks, you've also probably seen the AMD stickers, at least on the computers. In the gaming segment, I do believe that they're making up for lost ground here with their new chips, and I will be talking about those in a second. And then, of course, in the embedded segment, you got the AMD and then the Xilinx embedded products. And Xilinx, I believe, is that new acquisition that they recently made. And here's some recent highlights for AMD. So you can see that they did provide new details on their Zen 4 core architecture. And what I will point out is that they're planning their Zen 5 in 2024. And why does this matter? Well, this is the client segment. And so here's where Intel, their number one competitor, hasn't even caught up to the technology that the Zen 4 possesses. And so AMD is already planning the Zen 5. Here's where AMD is going to get blown out of the water. So although AMD has 40% market share and Intel has 60%, I do expect that to sort of flip, and I do expect AMD in the future to own this marketplace. Now, with the AMD CDNA, now you'll see that they have CDNA and RDNA. The CDNA chips are for their data centers, so it's more for computing power. And so they are expected to increase their competitiveness in this market. And I really do believe that it's a two-competitor market with NVIDIA and AMD in this space. Now, with their RDNA chips, they're moving into the third generation graphics architecture, which is expected to deliver more than 50% greater performance per watt. So here's where they're utilizing the Taiwan Semiconductor 5 nanometer process. And I do believe that that RDNA architecture will give NVIDIA a strong competition. My suspicion, and I'm just parroting some stuff that I've read from other people, so this is not necessarily an original thought, but my suspicion based on what I've read is that even if performance for their third generation graphics architecture is not as strong as NVIDIA GPUs, it may be cheaper for AMD to produce these GPUs due to the smaller die sizes, and therefore price them strongly to attack the RTX 4000 models. And so that makes a lot of sense if you have a 5 nanometer process competing with a 7 nanometer process. And so you might be wondering exactly what is the difference between CDNA chips and RDNA chips. And so this graphic sort of explains it, where the CDNA is really for sort of servers and computing power, so flops per second. And of course, the RDNA gaming sort of products are more for real-time gaming, so like the frames per second focus. So I really hope that helps. This really helped me in understanding, but of course, I'm a huge noob when it comes to this, and so I'm learning just as much as you guys are. Now let's go into the model that I've built out for the Patreon subscribers. And so notice that the margins have been expanding with the increase in revenue. So revenues have tripled from 2012 to 2021, and notice that the gross profit margins have also doubled from 22% in 2012 to almost 50% in 2021. And notice that the operating profit margins have also surged. And of course, with all of the cash that they've been generating, notice that the cash from operations is much higher than the PP&E being invested because they're expensing all of the sort of costs that go into coming up with these chips. Expect more buybacks in the future. Notice that they bought back $2 billion of shares in 2021. And they have launched a new buyback program. So once again, expect more. The other thing that I do want to point out is notice how shareholder friendly they are. Their stock-based compensation at a percentage of revenue is in the 2% range. So AMD, very shareholder friendly. And here's what I mean about expect more buybacks into the future. Notice that the cash equivalents plus the short-term investments equals around $3.5 billion of excess capital. And so it amounts to around $2 per share. So that's what I mean about expect additional share buybacks into the future. And look, they have very little debt. And so the question is, what does the valuation look like? Well, before we go into the valuation, I do want to point out that approximately 80% of the watch time on this channel is from people that are not subscribed. So please, if you have the opportunity, subscribe to the channel. Now let's dive right into the valuation. Like I said, this is probably the cheapest of the chip makers that I really love. My EPS valuation is a bit of a non-GAAP valuation to adjust out for the amortization of acquired intangibles, which is what I discussed earlier in this video. So I'm using a terminal multiple of 20 times earnings, which I believe is on the low end. But notice that that 20 times earnings multiple gives you an EPS valuation of $114 per share. Compare that to the $58 per share where the shares are currently trading at, and you have a share price as a percentage of its intrinsic value of 51%. So, of course, it's not advice, but AMD absolutely will end up in my portfolio based on the current share price. Now, how do you get access to the NVIDIA model and the AMD model and, of course, the Intel model, which the Patreons already have access to? Well, you can get access to all of that at the lower tier of the Patreon. And if you want to join us for an epic live presentation, you can join us at that higher tier. Now, I did recently release a video on NVIDIA that I think is very important for you guys to take a look. And so in order to get access to that video, I've made it available right here.